Hello and welcome to another episode of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Jeremy Weeks. Jeremy, can you give us a little bit of information about who you are and what you do?
Thanks, Johnny and Jack. Like John said, my name's Jeremy Weeks. I'm an exercise physiologist. I work for a small little country town hospital called Neil, which is halfway between Melbourne and Adelaide.
It's basically exactly halfway, isn't it?
Yeah, it's basically exactly halfway. I work as an exercise physiologist there. Used to do a little bit of work in sport and everything, but made a little bit of a career directional change and now working in a hospital setting.
I was going to say, I think one of the other important bits of information that you need to highlight is your actual running background and obviously your particular interest and passion in distance running particularly, yeah? Yeah,
certainly. That's why I got into a lot of, or interested in physiology in the first place was my interest in running and trying to study training programs and things like that. And from there, that kind of grew my passion for physiology. So,
well, you seem to know a thing or two about it, hence why we want to hear.
So.
Well, I think we'll start with the biggest question first. How do you build metabolic capacity or conditioning?
Yeah, it is a very loaded question to start with, John.
we don't like to ask
in
little
10
questions.
words or less, please.
Yeah. I don't particularly like the phrase metabolic conditioning. I think it...
Explain.
Well, it got a lot of traction a little while ago, I think from... And I'm not here to shit on the CrossFit industry or anything like that, but it kind of came out of a lot of people seeing these big concurrent training sessions that people were doing, and they would often be described as a metabolic conditioning session and things like that. Whereas whenever we're providing some sort of training stimulus, we're obviously going to get some sort of metabolic conditioning to it as well. We're building some sort of metabolic capacity. So
you can't separate these subsystems out, yeah.
Absolutely not. And that metabolic adaptation is going to be vastly different compared to what the stimulus is. Like if I'm training a weightlifter or something like that, the metabolic capacity I'm trying to engineer there basically is going to be a lot different to what I'm trying to produce with a endurance athlete, or even like the difference between a long sprinter and a short sprinter. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of different adaptations. If I'm working with a weightlifter there, one of the big metabolic adaptations I want is they might want to be able to store more intramuscular phosphocreatine there in their muscles. That's going to be useless for endurance athletes. So,
and it's going to require a very different type of stressor to actually create that physiological change.
Yeah, exactly. So, metabolic capacity and conditioning as a term, I think, is such a broad term that it needs to be sort of refined into a couple of different sort of subsets of categories and everything as well. So, but how do you build it for an endurance athlete? Basically, you have to do a lot of work.
Well, not even necessarily for endurance, because I think that leads on to the question, like, what are the key parameters of metabolic conditioning and of these metabolic systems? Like you mentioned, obviously, the phosphocreatine capacity in someone like a weightlifter who's doing repeated high-intensity bouts of exertion. You know, what are the key parameters in your mind? And do they match exactly what's in, say, textbooks and the literature, or have you started to dive into some extra areas that you think are relevant and maybe not discussed as much?
Well, I think probably the biggest one we could talk about is lactate then. And lactate's going to be a big one for endurance athletes and sort of like your more intermediate middle distance runners and your short to long sprinters as well. So how we want to tolerate and use lactate is going to be different based on that continuum as well. So if I've got a longer sort of sprinter, I want them to be able to tolerate high levels of lactate towards the end of a 200, 400 metre race, 800 metre race, compared to if I've got an athlete who's wanting to run a 10K or a half marathon or something like that. We want them to be able to clear and utilise that lactate very efficiently to the point where they don't accumulate so much lactate in their blood.
That actually raises an interesting point, because you talk about lactate being two different things. One thing of can you tolerate it, but then two, can you actually utilise it as an energy substrate? So can you actually explain that a little bit further and where you'll see more of an emphasis on one component where you need to be able to tolerate it versus the other where you can potentially actually utilise it? Because I'm assuming depending on the actual physical parameters of the task you're doing it might just be more one or the other potentially?
Yeah, well, lactate's kind of got three main functions. It acts to buffer hydrogen ions, it acts as a fuel source, and it acts as almost like a hormone as well. It does a lot of signaling with the brain, the heart, and the liver as well.
It's interesting that, because I feel like it's only been the last, 5 or 10 years where that's started to become more well understood, that it's not just this byproduct that we don't want to have anything to do with.
Yeah.
You hear it even now still on commentary, they've become lactic and now they're blowing up or whatever. But that's a very simplistic view of what lactate does.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at what it is as a compound, lactate, really simply, it's just sort of 3 carbon molecules, 6 hydrogen molecules, and 3 oxygen molecules. And how it becomes that is because when we use glycogen, we break it down into pyruvate, and then pyruvate without oxygen will become lactate. And how it becomes lactate is because it takes on 2 of those hydrogen ions, and that's how you form lactate. And that's that buffering sort of system.
So it's trying to absorb those hydrogen ions.
Hydrogen ions. It's so I think one of the reasons why it came out in the literature, a lot of the fatigue early on, is because they saw, there's an increase in lactate levels in the blood, that must be contributing to fatigue. But really what it's doing is it's buffering those hydrogen ions there, taking them on so that the pH levels within the muscle and everything don't become too acidic. And then from there, obviously it can be used as a fuel, like we spoke about. So basically what happens when we get more oxygen into the area, those hydrogen ions get converted into water, and it goes back to pyruvate, and that goes into the mitochondria, and it can be used to create energy that way. And then it can also be used like a signaling sort of device, almost like a hormone, like we said. And it can go up to the brain, the heart, and then even other muscles that aren't being used at the time, as a way of almost storing glycogen as well. So it's an pretty incredible compound, and it's got a lot of misleading information around it.
Last week I listened to a podcast you mentioned before we were talking game Faf, and he was saying one of the things that he got really interested in the 90s, because the mobile lactic or lactate testing kits with the blood became possible to do easily and readily at the track. And one of the things that he recognised was, actually, if we get our sprinters to do 15 block starts, by the end of the session, their lactate level is actually higher than a 400-metre runner at the end of a 400-metre run. And he started to put forward this thought, maybe we don't really understand exactly what this is doing. And obviously, you've mentioned the research is starting to, or has definitely said that over these last 10 years. But the thing that I think is interesting about that, and I remember there was an Italian study looking at 100-metre sprinters, where this was again I believe this was in the 90s as well. They just got a heap of sprinters to do 100 metres, and they tested their lactate, and they were scoring 18, 20 millimoles of lactate, which you'd expect that someone would be dying if they did that. Why is it that, from your understanding, is it that you see even, say, people only participating in something for 10, 11, 12 seconds, that they are able to generate so much lactate? And is that a reflection of an inability of their system to be able to buffer, or a very high level of capability in buffering, and that's what leads to that high performance output?
Well, I think with that, because the energy demand is so high at the start, it takes so long for our VO2 kinetics to come up to be able to buffer that as well. So you're going to produce so much lactate because there's no oxygen in there for your body to utilise to break down the pyruvate, so it gets converted to lactate. And then after that, you see afterwards that, hands on the head or down on their knees sort of thing, trying to get in as much oxygen as they can. That's getting in that oxygen to try and, like we spoke about, convert that lactate back into pyruvate, and then going back into, it can be converted into energy. I think the reason why they can generate so much towards the end is because the demand for energy at the start is so big, and there's that window there where there's not a lot of oxygen there, and you're trying to get your VO2 kinetics up to get in more oxygen so that it can be used. That's why there's so much excess lactate there towards the end of a race.
I guess it also highlights that they have such an ability to tolerate such high levels then too, which is clearly something that you need as an elite sprinter.
Well, it's interesting because it's speaking with the Vish, the performance scientist from the VIS, and we did some lactate testing with some of our athletes to actually see what happens across a session for a sprinter. And he was explaining to me how, because they actually don't have the vascularization within their tissue, you see their lactate levels actually rise slower than the distance athletes. He's like, with the distance athletes, after 30 seconds, I've got a pretty good reading of what's going on. Yeah. With the sprinters, he's like, I'll test them straight after, and then I'll test them 3 minutes later, and then I'll test them 5, and it keeps going up.
Yeah, okay.
Whereas with the distance runners, it'll go up quickly, but then it'll drop quickly because they actually have much more, angiogenesis that's occurred from the type of training they do, where a lot of their, muscle tissue particularly has a vast and ready source of, blood vessels available to it to deliver, oxygen.
So I guess you could suggest then, if you think of the two ends of the spectrums, for that speed power athlete who is very anaerobic in nature, one of the key elements for them to develop is a tolerance to lactate, as opposed to the other end of the spectrum when you've got an endurance athlete who is much more aerobic and uses oxidative energy systems. It's their ability to then buffer and then utilise that lactate through the liver and through gluconeogenesis,
Yes. Well, and just glycolysis as well, because it gets converted back into pyruvate and it goes back into the mitochondria that way. So, it's... exactly, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there's endurance athletes, they've got to be able to tolerate low levels of lactate for prolonged periods of time. But the way they can tolerate... The interesting thing about it... I'll start again. The interesting thing about it is we can't measure how much lactate we're actually producing. We're only measuring how much is in the blood.
Yes, it's a completely different measure.
It's a completely different measure. So we don't know how much in the muscle there is that the endurance sort of athlete is, because they're so efficient, they're able to just utilise right then and there.
I think we should have biopsies that are going on while someone's running.
Hey, we'll probably be able to do that eventually with some type of nanotechnology, I imagine. Well, that actually brings the question up then of, what does lactate threshold testing provide any benefit or information for programming?
Certainly for endurance athletes it does. Okay. And even not even at the lactate threshold, I think even below that as well, when you see that first turn point.
Do you want to explain the turn points?
Yeah, so typically when you do some sort of graded exercise testing, going up to like maximal sort of exertion or something like that, there's two main turn points that we see. And initially the first one happens at around about 2 millimole or less. And then the lactate threshold that everyone sort of refers to happens at around about 4 millimole, where we see this just jump
inflection point.
Yeah, an inflection point in the graph, and you see this big jump in lactate accumulation within the blood.
Yep. How does that relate to things like VO2 max?
In terms of VO2 max, well, VO2 max is typically a fair bit above your lactate threshold. The amount of lactate in the blood for someone at VO2 max can differ quite dramatically depending on their training history and everything.
Okay, so it's not like that 4 millimole sort of measure. It's not like you can say, okay, when they're at this level, they're close to their VO2 max.
Yeah, I mean, some people, their VO2 max, their lactate thresholds might be 95% of their VO2 max, and others it might be a fair bit less. And that, again, comes back to how efficient they are at clearing that lactate when it's being produced. Yeah.
You mentioned before, the VO2 kinetics. What are the features of that, and how does that influence what we see in terms of endurance performance?
Well, obviously the biggest thing is you're trying to get in more oxygen, so you need to increase your respiratory rate, your breathing rate, and things like that. So these are actually quite well correlated as well with those turn points that we were talking about on the lactate turn point, the lactate curve as well. So typically we see an increase in breathing rates, and that's why you'll hear coaches often refer to, all right, I want you to be able to go on this run, but I want you to be able to hold a conversation the whole time.
So you feel like that's actually quite well correlated with...
Yeah, with lactate turn point 1 and lactate turn point 2. And you can see that talking sort of method is very well correlated to those things. When you don't have access to those tools, I think it's a good way of supplementing in a monitoring sort of system for it. Yeah.
In So going back to thinking of this idea of metabolic capacity, I think the thing that you're really highlighting here is we need to be a bit more specific of what actual capacity do they need. When we think about team sports, we're going to need quite a variety, because if you think of soccer, football, AFL, whatever it is, there's periods of walking, there's periods of jogging, there's periods of acceleration, sprinting, and so on. How do we go about determining the metabolic capacity for those types of sports when you actually need a whole spectrum of different capacities?
Yeah, well, you have to go through a big needs analysis, I think. But looking at, now that we've got access to GPS data and things like that, we can quantify a lot better how much time people are spending in certain speed zones, and then how much time they're spending at, say, like elevated heart rates and things like that as well. So we're able to break down the demands of the game a lot better, and positionally as well. In terms of building it, I think you have to look at doing your testing there. All right, this athlete might be more of a speed power bias sort of athlete, or they're going to respond better to those sort of training parameters. How are we going to also build their endurance capabilities within that? And you're probably going to train them a lot differently compared to what you would say someone who has a bigger endurance profile. How you train those two athletes?
Okay, that brings up the question, because I think I get asked this a lot. Do you profile, say, someone who is more speed-based and give them something that's more akin to what they're good at? Or are you going and working on some of their weaknesses and allowing them to spend more time doing endurance-type activity because you've got to push that, say, base level up? It's this constant debate of, do you work on strengths or do you work on weaknesses, and which one's going to, lift, as they say, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, I would try and bias towards more their strengths, but in the same time, I would try and as well increase or manipulate the parameters around their training program to get more of an aerobic response or a cardiorespiratory response.
How would you do that with someone like that? So if you had someone who, they're maybe, you typically find that it seems to be forwards tend to, usually small forwards, especially in, say, AFL or in hockey or in soccer, in strikers, they tend to be faster, but they tend to not necessarily always have a big engine when it comes to aerobic capability. What kind of approach would you take with someone like that? How do you sort of like to plan those things?
Well, you might try and increase the aerobic demands of a session. Like if they're still wanting to do a lot of running, you might keep the efforts and everything still short, but reduce the recovery times in between the efforts and things like that. I think if you're trying to get them to go and do prolonged jogging and things like that, that's when they're going to lose interest. They're going to not get the adaptations that we want either. They still want to be able to maintain a high level of intensity throughout the game, but we want to be able to tolerate that sort of intensity they can get to for longer periods of time as well. So trying to build their volume up that way rather than looking at it from a slower approach.
Yeah, because I guess this brings up the question then too of, if you start providing a stimulus that isn't reflective of that individual's phenotype, are you going to create negative adaptations in terms of their muscle profiling as well? Because again, it comes back to your question, do you actually are you potentially going to actually have a negative impact on their strengths by working on their weaknesses too much? Because the other thing, and you probably know this, well, I imagine you definitely know this research better than I do, but if you think about building up, say, metabolic capacity, if we're going to use that term, it's regulated through that molecular pathway of PGC1 alpha. But there is actually some research from what I understand that you can actually see more specific adaptations if you use a more high intensity type of training to the type 2 fibers than the type 1 fibers if you're doing more of that very submaximal slow stuff. And so with that, you can actually highlight that you're essentially building the metabolic capacity of type 2 fibers in those fast type of athletes by doing high intensity type of training versus the metabolic capacity of type 1 fibers of doing the slow stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, PGC1 offers, you can throw a lot at it and it's kind of upregulated even after sort of strength training as well. But yeah, certainly, like you spoke about with the type 1 and 2 fibers, with doing high intensity work for prolonged periods, and like we spoke about manipulating rest periods or manipulating sort of the length of when they're doing the sprints, you're still going to get a good response. For those listening who don't know what PGC1 alpha is, it's responsible for mitochondrial biogenesis. So you're still going to get a good response to mitochondrial for developing your mitochondria function and capacity.
So taking a step back then and thinking about profiling, do you apply a particular method for thinking about whether you see someone as being more that fast twitch type athlete versus slow twitch?
Yeah, I think you can see it a little bit in the way that they perform. Yeah.
They
you can almost look at them.
Yeah. But there are some guys where you test them and they seem to be just good all round at everything as well.
That's not me.
And they provide a little bit more of a challenge of where you want to work on what they might be biased towards in terms of what they're going to improve.
But sort of like a hybrid, aren't they?
Yeah, sort of like a hybrid. You see it a lot with the AFL guys. They're sort of pretty good with endurance, pretty good with their speed, but they're not exceptional at either sort of thing. So, and that speaks to the all-round general capacity that you need for the game as well.
Well, and the other end of the spectrum then, I think of, say, like the anaerobic speed reserve, where if you have someone, again, in team sports, if you've got someone who is more of that endurance type athlete, they've got a really great VO2 max, but they don't necessarily actually have quite a good maximal speed. Do you actually think that there is a case for those type of athletes where their anaerobic speed reserve is quite narrow because the gap between those is quite small to actually work more on the speed element as opposed to trying to build up their VO2 max?
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's not just in team sports as well. It has a lot of application in like swimming and running and cycling and those sort of sports as well.
Just like anaerobic power reserve, yeah.
Yeah, well, even like if you think about if the race starts off a lot quicker, something like that, they're going to need that buffer between their top speed and what their VO2 max is. Where if it's too close together and they've got to go to this level that they're not used to, they're going to fatigue a lot quicker. They can't handle the stress of the initial stages of the race. So I think you can see that a lot, not just in team sports, where I think it's very applicable as well, but also in those individual type sports.
Well, middle distance events, I guess, are a key example of that, where you actually might have a good 800 or 1500 meter run if it's a relatively consistent speed, but if it's very tactical, where you've got athletes who are continually changing their speeds, the individual's performance may differ massively.
The question I always, and this is my bias to shitting on distance runners, but do you think that, I always get really frustrated watching a lot of distance races where, even at the elite level, where you watch some athletes and you know what style of runner they are. They're a sit and kicker or they're almost a time trialer. And in a competitive environment, particularly championships, typically no one wants to take the pace up. So it's going to obviously suit the sit-kick style of racing. And the people who are the time trialers, I never understand why, one, they either don't develop more of that capability, which I know it's not easy to do, but they don't develop more of that. Or two, they don't just say, screw it, I'm going out at the pace I want to go out at, and if I get caught, I get caught, but at least I have a chance of winning. Like a David Rudisha type, just go for it and break everyone.
Yeah.
I don't understand. It drives me insane watching people who can't kick, typically. You're like, oh, well, the race is over. You may as well stop.
Yeah. Yeah, it does happen. I mean, typically those guys that can sit and kick as well now, especially in like the 5,000, 10,000, they're the fastest guys anyway as well. And you see less and less of these the really fast 1,500 metre guys going up to the 5K and just sitting in the pack and kicking over everyone. And at the speed at which they're running the 5,000 metres and championships and everything now has definitely changed.
What do you think's been the impetus for that? Do you think that there's actually been a change in style of training, a change in style of racing, or do you think that our understanding of physiology has changed and coaching practices changed, or do you think that it's just been an evolution of the performance getting better?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because if you look back at the training history from 50, 60 years ago, the training's pretty similar. Certainly, I think there's a lot more of a speed development focus in those sort of runners now.
And do you think that's being influenced by this stuff like Jack's talking about, like anaerobic speed reserve, people knowing that there needs to be a bigger gap between their maximal speed and their VO2 max speed?
Yeah, certainly. Certainly, I think there is. And they're sort of the little nuances. But in terms of the overall programming from, 50, 60 years ago, it seems to be pretty similar. But yeah, those little nuances like your top end speed and things like that, I think has certainly become more prevalent in those endurance athletes.
With distance running, like, and I'm happy to go into this area now because we have a lot of listeners that are middle distance runners or up, and it's good to have someone like yourself on there. How do these factors relate to things like running economy? These seem to be these are to me factors that are to do with, as you mentioned, VO2 kinetics, your ability to use your energy systems to produce the required energy at a metabolic level. But they're a little bit different to something like running economy.
Particularly when you're getting towards that elite level.
Yeah. Do you want to sort of explain a little bit like how they interrelate but are not necessarily the same thing?
Yeah, and I think I'll talk about it as well. Like when we talk about things like sprinting, obviously we talk a lot about mechanical efficiency, where the metabolic demands aren't going to be almost the limiting factor a lot of the times with...
Well, they're just not.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting. I'll bring this up now just because I was looking at it recently for a course we're putting together. But, people like Angus Ross, for instance, have put out data in the early 2000s looking at the neural influence on sprint performance. And even, in the early 2000s, he was saying, like, we pretty much believe that speed maintenance, the reason that you get a deceleration speed at the end of, say, a 100-meter race, actually has nothing to do with energy production. It has to do with a reduction in the firing frequency generated from your central nervous system to the peripheral systems. And for that reason in itself, like, obviously...
Like ion kinetics, perhaps, as opposed to...
Yeah, but it's not energy production. It's not because it transfers from, say, a phosphagen-based kind of energy production to more of,
anaerobic glycogen.
An anaerobic sort of process. So it's interesting in that sense, because I think that's not actually always how people think of it. They still think, there needs to be, you need to do some lactic work if you want to run 100 meters. And as time has gone on from my end, it's almost like, can you produce that mechanical and maintain that mechanical output through training your brain to continue to fire for long enough?
Yeah, and maintain those positions that you need to. Yeah. Whereas when we push into more the endurance athletes, it's more, from a similar sort of perspective, the amount of oxygen we can take in is never the limiting factor either. Yeah. And it's more how we can utilise it. So one of the biggest things, like we spoke about with economy, is how well you can utilise the oxygen, how we spoke about with lactate, how well you can clear it, how well you can convert it back into pyruvate, make it into energy to be used during the race. And that's probably one of the biggest things in terms of economy, is that how well we can continually use oxygen without some of those byproducts accumulating that require oxygen for that to be cleared. Yeah.
Actually, on that point, one of the other things I know that influences oxygen kinetics a lot is carbon dioxide. Because particularly if you create a large gradient at the tissue level to the blood of a lot of carbon dioxide, it actually helps with the release of oxygen to get into the tissue. But one of the issues associated with hyperventilation is breathing out too much carbon dioxide. Is that something that you think is relevant to aerobic performance and something that actually people need to learn to tolerate better?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, even when we go through glycolysis as well, there's free carbon molecules that need to bind to oxygen as well. So we get this accumulation of carbon dioxide. And you look at the reason why we can tell how much sort of fat we're burning versus how much carbohydrate we're burning is the ratio.
CO2 release, yeah.
Yeah, of the CO2 release. I think there's probably a few more people who are better qualified talking about the
well, you're better qualified than us.
VO2 kinetics and things like that as well. But
but even, like, I'm sure you probably even have some people to point us towards if people do want to look into some of that research. Are there someone or people that you would sort of recommend reading about?
Yeah, guys like Mark Burnley, they do a lot of research over there in the UK. Andrew Jones, a few of those guys have done a lot of research on VO2 kinetics that you can kind of look into, that are very well versed in that sort of thing. Mark Burnley's got a really good little YouTube channel as well that have some good shorts if people can go
we'll check that out. I think that's useful. In terms of, like we went back to running economy, I don't think we necessarily explained exactly what it is. In your mind, how do you sort of view something like running economy? And what are some of the factors from that mechanical standpoint that you can look to address from the perspective of, say, distance running?
Well, basically, I look at it, how much oxygen you're using at different speeds.
Yeah.
So if we can use less, if we don't require as much oxygen at higher speeds, then we should be able to tolerate higher speeds as well with more oxygen intake. So, it goes back to, like we said before, oxygen never is really the limiting factor, the amount we can get in, because we're always breathing out more oxygen as well. But how well we're utilising the oxygen at that speed, what it's directed towards. We spoke about angiogenesis before as well. So how well we can distribute it around the muscles so that it can be used to metabolize energy, and then we can propel ourselves forward. And I think if we look at, and you could speak to this a bit more, John, it's not just the metabolic parameters, but it's also the tissue characteristics that we're developing as well at those sort of speeds that's going to help with running economy a lot.
Well, we spoke about this a fair bit. I remember, before you ended up moving to the country, but I've always had this thought that the long runs that athletes go on as distance runners, it's usually, your Sunday long run, and they're running for 60, 90, 120 minutes, whatever it is. That actually that does less, in my mind, does less to develop VO2 capability as it does to actually develop the long-term adaptations of their tissue to become stiffer. I don't know what you think about that. I know we sort of briefly mentioned it, but does that seem reasonable, or does that seem like I'm talking absolute rubbish?
Well, it does seem reasonable as well. I mean, certainly there's benefits from those longer runs in terms of fat oxidation and things like that, and improving mitochondrial density. There's certainly adaptations with that, and I think there probably is some tissue characteristics that are quite transferable in terms of performance. There's not a lot of research around it or anything, and I think it's just sort of a good thought experiment to talk about as well, though.
Well, I think it'd be a cool study to do, something like where you take someone you realise, okay, you guys are novices in terms of your distance running, but you're sort of saying, okay, well, I'm committing to this, and you go, over the course of a year, we're going to take your long run from 45 minutes to, 90 plus minutes. What actually happens in the characteristics of your Achilles, calf complex, and lower limb stiffness properties?
Well, I was just going to say, 'cause I think the thing there is, I guess it's like most things, it's going to be a combination of both, because when you're talking about stiffness here, you're talking about active stiffness more specifically. So part of that has to do with the particular characteristics of the connective tissue to be able to store energy more effectively. Part of it has to do with the coordination of your muscular system to be able to control that. And then part of that is to be able to maintain that for repeated bouts based on your metabolic capacity to be able to continually provide energy for the active component to contract on a regular, consistent basis.
Yeah, I'm interested in what it does in terms of like the actual changes to tissue characteristics.
Sure.
Because like, as you mentioned, obviously some of it's got to do with that skill component. And, even early 2000s, I know we've spoken about this before, Weeksy, of, people like Philo Saunders doing research in the early 2000s, physiologist based at the AIS, who's a top level coach as well, showing that plyometric training for distance runners improve running economy. And I find that hilarious because I basically have never seen distance runners doing plyometrics. But it's as he's almost saying before, it's like running economy, it's like free energy.
Well, is part of that, and probably either you can answer this, but does that depend on how developed the athlete is and where they are based on their training history? Like for the untrained athlete, them actually building up their VO2 max by doing those really slow submaximal runs and building up their metabolic machinery is going to be very beneficial. But then you're going to get that issue of window of diminishing return. So then you actually need to think about what other elements of running economy can I improve. One of them is VO2 max, but it's certainly not the only
I think the
one.
cool thing is with something like the addition of plyometrics, because the volume that you're doing is probably not that significant, the benefit that you get, as you said, is centrally driven in terms of that skill acquisition to create active stiffness. So it's not going to be something that's going to be deleterious to your development of VO2 capability. It's not like you're like, I'm now going to do 90% of my training as plyometrics and only do a little bit of running because my running economy is going to be fantastic. It's something that you can do as a small addition that actually may have very fast alterations and applications, because basically your brain works out, I can create a good stable platform to bounce off, rather than thinking, I'm just going to run along and let my foot, ankle, knee, hip just
slap the ground basically.
And just collapse.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty easy thing to just add in as well. The research that Philo did, they weren't doing massive plyometrics or anything as well. It was pretty simple things that you could almost just tack onto the end of sessions or in your warm-up and things like that. So, yeah, if you're listening to this and you're a fun runner and trying to improve your 5K or something, add in a few little jumps at the start of your warm-up and everything, it will make a big difference to your running economy.
Yeah. I think, and I think that that's a really interesting area, because I think that we see that's obviously something that relates heavily to that maximal speed, and then that can obviously alter that anaerobic, speed reserve quite significantly.
I think as well, with plyometrics, I mean, sometimes people hear the term plyometrics and they think about doing these massive hurdle jumps or those big stair jumps and things like that to see what jumpers can do. It doesn't have to be those big explosive efforts. Sometimes with it's those repeated, just smaller jumps and things like that that's training the brain as well. It's going to improve your running economy over a longer period of time.
I think the key thing, and I saw someone sort of going on a bit of a Twitter rant recently about this, with the term plyometric versus jump training, I think the big thing that you kind of have to be thinking about is the contact time, and the rate of force development needs to be extremely fast.
Yeah.
So even if you're doing very small sort of pogo type jumps, whether it's double leg or single leg, the whole concept is, how do I create this bouncing motion with as little time on the ground as possible? And that in itself is the thing that kind of differentiates plyometric training to more traditional jump training, where you're not necessarily limiting the amount of time that you're using to create propulsion.
Yeah, and that's probably an important thing, because if you think of jogging, it is a plyometric, well, it's a stretch shortening cycle type movement, but your ground reaction or ground contact times, are going to be much more prolonged.
Well, they're still not that prolonged,
relatively.
Yeah, ground contact times in jogging, sometimes they're still going to be around 150 milliseconds.
Yeah, okay.
So it's still very fast.
Yeah.
Most people even struggle to be able to do that for a drop jump. Or a depth jump sort of task.
And it's still, 3 times your body weight.
Yeah, so it's a high velocity, high force task.
Yeah, exactly.
With a lot of rate of force development required. So that's why those active stiffness properties actually have such a keen effect on running economy.
It's where as well, I think it's probably misinterpreted in, if we're screening for injuries and things like that, people don't often look at how someone jogs, things like shin splints and those sort of things. It's typically when you get fatigue, you can't develop that stiffness in your ankle or your knee. Upon landing, they tend to drop and they create those big angles where there's a lot of shearing going through the front of the shin that you can cause some little injuries. Whereas I think people sometimes often just think about, all right, what were they doing, during the session? How are they executing there? And they're not looking at how they were jogging just to warm up.
From a mechanical standpoint. Yeah.
Something that's always stood out to me with you, Jeremy, is 1, you're very intelligent, and 2, you have a very good understanding of the science and the principles that come from that. And before you moved to the country, you're working more with athletic populations, but now I imagine you're working with a very different population group, probably more within the general population. And I'm interested to hear, has your framework with how you approach treating these people change, and or do you use still the similar principles?
Still use the same principles. I think, like anything, whenever you get a patient, you still got to do your big needs analysis. And then from there, you're always trying to apply the principles, I think, that you'll learn from the elite athletes that you try and study and apply it to the general population. It's still a muscle cell. It's still got the same organs and everything. So I think you can take a lot of the principles for it and apply it to just the general population all the time. I was listening to, I'm not sure if you guys know who Inigo San Milan is, and him talk about how, for those who don't know, he coaches Tadej Pogacar, who won the 2020 and 2021 Tour de France, second youngest guy ever to win it. But he's also got a lot of research in type 2 diabetes. And the way he approaches looking at like type 2 diabetes is, he goes, all right, there's so much dysfunction here, particularly within the mitochondria. How can I look at and how he terms it, the perfect mitochondria? And then he looks at like the top level cyclists and endurance athletes. How can we take the learnings from them and apply that to a patient with type 2 diabetes?
Give them lots of EPO.
Yeah.
Is that how?
Yeah.
It probably has some therapeutic benefit for people with type 2 diabetes, yeah?
Oh, I'm big on. I reckon we should microdose like elderly people and get help with a lot of things. Probably get in trouble for saying that now.
No, it's an interesting.
Well, not in a therapeutic sense.
No, but I've thought about this a lot, like post-surgery, of using like anabolic steroids to try and mitigate the detraining effect from not being able to do anything or weight bear. But I mean, that's probably a conversation for another time.
Yeah, well, they do use it though in hormone replacement therapies. Are quite common. So I don't think that it's out of place. Obviously, in a sporting context, it's considered outside of the rules. But there's nothing inherently bad about these medications or protocols from these pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I mean, certainly something like EPO. If you were to microdose it, how would that help with someone's breathlessness walking across the road and things like that?
It probably would help quite a bit.
Probably would help quite a bit, but I don't know. You have to try and find someone to fund the research for you.
Well, maybe you should do that research. See if you can get a grant.
Well, going back to thinking about the population groups you work with, what is different? Like, how do you, with the fact that a lot of these people, I imagine, are quite deconditioned, they may have multiple comorbidities, how do those factors influence how you approach applying interventions to them to actually see positive change? Yeah,
certainly you're thinking a lot more about what other pathologies they've got going on, how I'm going to apply a training stimulus that's going to be hard enough that's going to drive adaptation, but I'm not going to flare up something else, and I'm not going to put them at risk of having a heart attack and things like that as well. So it's still, my thought process probably hasn't changed a lot. I'm just more considerate of those other comorbidities that they have. But it still comes back to, for me, I'm trying to do a needs analysis, and at the end of it, I'm trying to think about, well, what are the main things I'm trying to drive from an adaptation process, and what are the sort of tissue characteristics I'm trying to engineer for this person to help with whatever pathology they've got. Or, I mean, I work with a lot of people, elderly people, and we're just trying to prevent falls and things like that with them as well. But also I work with a lot of patients that are sort of post-heart attack, like how am I going to drive enough stimulus in a safe manner post-heart attack to create change within the heart structure.
It's interesting you mentioned structure, because in a podcast, and we're trying to get him on this podcast, he's quite busy at the moment, is a discussion that I saw with we've seen with Tony Blazovic. And he talks about the fact that in the physiology research, in the sports and exercise science research, about 15, 20 years ago, people got really enamored with the idea of creating changes to tissue. And then with some of his research and the research that they conducted, they realized that actually if you drive more of the performance task and be the thing that directs where they need to go, you actually get the adaptations that you want. Do you see it that way, where if someone, for instance, needs to be able to walk 500 meters to do their shopping, that if you get them doing tasks that are similar to that, you're going to get the tissue changes that you want and the cellular changes that you want? Or do you try and create the cellular changes first and then start to expose them to that specific, ergonomic task?
Well, it's probably a bit of both, because, I mean, sometimes you're trying to improve, like, someone's walking capacity, for instance, and they don't have the endurance in their calf to be able to complete that task straight away. So you got to work on it simultaneously. I know you guys have spoke about periodization a fair bit on the podcast as well. So, but we're still I'm still thinking about those tissue changes, but doing the task is going to get those tissue changes as well.
This comes down to that sort of whole argument of, specificity.
Well, to add to your question, because this is something I found interesting, which I remember you did a presentation on this a few years ago. I was looking at the training programs of elite Kenyan runners, and like you'll be able to give me the specific statistics, but it was something like 90% of their running volume was at competitive pace.
Yeah.
Which that to me was quite interesting, because it's like, okay, so what does that highlight to me? That the specificity of the speed for their performance is not, it is important when they actually perform, but in terms of their training, it's actually at a sub-maximal level to create, I guess, a metabolic stressor to induce adaptation.
Yeah, certainly. And I think the thing is as well, we can't like we can't go out and do high intensity efforts every day and maximize training adaptation
and expect to survive.
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest things with that, and this is where a lot of the sort of zone 2 comes out of, that's that low intensity effort training that people talk about, is that it's the balance of that low intensity work enables enough stimulus to drive adaptation metabolically, particularly within the mitochondria and how we oxidize fat and clear lactate at those levels. And then also it provides enough recovery time for when we go and do those high intensity efforts that we can train hard enough to be at the requisite intensity we need to for the duration of the session.
I mean, this is just purely anecdotal, but since the start of this year, I've been walking every morning. Now, where I live, it's very hilly, so there is some, it is a bit more demanding than, say, walking on a flat surface, but I've noticed actually a big change in my body composition as a result. And I actually wonder...
Better or worse?
No, better. Couldn't get worse, could it, John? And I actually wonder if part of it has to do with the fact that my endurance capacity is probably quite poor. It's actually providing enough of a metabolic stressor that's improving my fat oxidative capacity.
Certainly. And that's one of the biggest things I think with weight loss is that sometimes people, they throw them into these high intensity efforts and they don't actually have the capacity to oxidize fat and use fat as a fuel source. We need to use fat as a fuel source as well, because like when we lose fat, essentially you breathe it out, it turns into carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
So you need to work on those capabilities as well, I think, with people trying to lose weight.
It's that idea of metabolic flexibility, of being able to use different energy sources.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is pretty much lost in the majority of people because they're either not applying the appropriate type of metabolic stress through exercise, or because of their diet too, because we eat particularly, very highly processed, refined carbohydrate diet. So you're not actually... you're not using that system again from an energy standpoint, from being like on a low carb diet, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we go on to one of the last areas that I would like to get onto, which is about sports performance, I wanted to ask you actually your thoughts on shoes and what influence you think these shoes have had. I know there's been some research into it, but it seems like we're approaching, on statistics alone, a golden era of performance in track and field. What do you think is the effect? And do you think that the effect is coming, in the moment of putting the shoes on for the race? Or do you think there's actually a much bigger effect that comes from the repeated training effect that you get from wearing a more high performance, say, footwear?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a training effect. I don't have a problem with the shoe technology. I think it's great. I think it's awesome.
It's more interesting.
Yeah, it's more interesting, and I think it's great what it's done for the sport and everything. I think certainly that exposing yourself to higher speeds for a prolonged period of time during training is a massive advantage. And there's speeds that these guys can maintain now, particularly on the road. Like these road records are just getting smashed every time they go out. So.
The thing that I find difficult, because it hasn't stabilized yet. We're seeing a lot of performance continue to improve rapidly, and I think the technology is getting better as well, which doesn't help. It's not going to stabilize anytime soon. But one of the things that I think we see is that it's very hard to put these performances in a historical context. Even as a sprint coach, it's really interesting to me because we're seeing, in Australia at least, this era where everyone's saying, oh, well, this is the best era of sprinters we've had. And I've been thinking about that. I was like, did we all of a sudden get all these genetic freaks? Did we all of a sudden all learn how to coach? Or is there something else going on? And in my mind, I think it's mostly to do with the shoes. Right? Whether it's long-term adaptation from training or it's shorter-term improvement from putting them on for races. But I don't necessarily believe that all of a sudden we've got this era where
the talent pool's just expanded
greatly.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to downplay people's performances you know, it's not suggesting that they're not good athletes and that they don't necessarily are not deserving of these accolades. But I just think it makes it very difficult to actually historically compare, because people say, oh, this is the third fastest time ever by an Australian. And you go, well, is it actually, or is it just that the technology is suggesting that?
Yeah.
Because there was not much improvement, I think, in shoes up until about 5 years ago. From probably the late 80s, early 90s, the technology was pretty similar. It was mostly plastic, you know, technology.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the distance events as well, we're quite deep in all the events. There seems to be, you know, we're putting 3 people out there every time in the major championships, which is great. But I still think Herb Elliott's the best 1,500 metre runner Australia's ever had.
Why do you say that?
I think just with what he was able to do in that era, he never lost a 1,500. He broke the world record in the Olympic Games final. I think if you put him in today's environment right now, he'd probably run 3:30, sub 3:30 almost.
Yeah.
But that's not to downplay what, for example, Ollie Hoare did last year in the Commonwealth Games. So that's a massive run. I mean, yeah, in terms of a historical context, I mean, I think you've just got to put it and look at it as almost like a world rankings. Where does it sit within a world rankings right now? Initially, when Nike brought out those shoes, sort of like, what was it, 6 years ago, I think, when they came out with the 4%, and it wasn't access, like not every brand had access to those sort of, that technology. That's when I did have a bit of a problem with it, but it doesn't seem to be a problem anymore.
No,
everyone's got their own range of these super shoes. Asics, New Balance, Adidas, they've all got them. Everyone's running super fast times on the road and on the track with them now. So I think it's great for the sport. The technology innovation is great. It's interesting with technology and how, like, when innovation comes in, there's always going to be big backlash. There's always going to be people
People don't like change.
Yeah, people don't like change.
No.
Well, it's usually the ex-athletes whose records are going to get smashed that don't like it.
Yeah, that's true as well.
One of the things that I find interesting about it is whether there are differences that you see. And I'll ask you this question because it's an observation that I've made that I don't know if I've said to people, but I think that people whose properties are less likely to give outcomes of, say, very good active stiffness through their foot and ankle, i.e. people with shorter tendons and potentially, say, Caucasian or Asian compared to West African descent athletes or even East African descent athletes who have much longer structures in that area of their body, which is going to be advantageous for those properties of active stiffness. Whether the advantage isn't allowed there to be an evening up of that feature, and whether we're seeing now a greater distribution of evenness across different ethnicities in certain events. You know, like an example I would give is if you look at 100-meter finals, you know, we saw an Asian athlete, you know, make the 100-meter final in the men's. We saw a Swiss athlete, you know, white Swiss athlete make the women's 100-meter final. We're seeing a lot more athletes who in the past may not have actually been represented perform at a much higher level consistently. You know, even with the in America, it's obviously been a huge thing. What's the American female sprinter, the white one? I've gone blank in my mind. You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yeah.
She came out of the collegiate system. And obviously we've had Jenna Prandini as well previous to that. And I don't know whether, like, I'm completely hypothetical here and I'm postulating, but whether what these shoes do is actually even it out, because one of the features that did separate those different ethnicities was the fact that their function of their lower limb actually highly boosted, say, running economy and mechanical efficiency. And that's actually, that advantage is being taken away from them because of shoe technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just thinking maybe, like, even with the marathoners, you probably don't see as many of those short striding, high frequency cadence marathoners anymore. And I wonder if the shoes are not as advantage for that sort of style.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that as much though, and whether it's evened out the playing field across.
Well, the reason that I say,
but do you see that in the sense that better performances are happening from non-African descent people with these shoes?
Yes, and the other thing that I know, the reason that I noticed this, and I'm putting this forward, is I think that particularly in the sprints, we've seen a much bigger advantage to female athletes than we have to males. We've seen a bigger improvement both in Australia and internationally in terms of the performances in relation to, say, the world record, and the depth at which we've seen those occur has been greater in female athletes. And I think that that's because they actually don't have the same stiffness properties that the male athletes have. It's one of the reasons why females cannot actually run as fast over those sprint events as males in general.
Yep.
Some of it's got to do with anthropometrics, muscle mass, all those kind of things, but one of them is the amount of stiffness that they can create, and the forces that generates in ground reaction are not going to be as great. And that's what made me notice. I was like, I think women get a bigger advantage out of these shoes than men.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I haven't really dived into it as much, but yeah, certainly I'll take notice of it more.
And I think across the board with distance running, it's been more even in terms of how much improvement, because they don't have those properties generally, they don't develop them, and it's not what is not that it doesn't, but it's not usually the only thing that separates their performance. Whereas in sprints, the people who are mechanically more effective in applying forces to the ground are the better athletes already, whereas you can have people who are mechanically inefficient in distance events who make up for it with metabolic capacities.
In your observations, have you seen a higher prevalence of, say, calf strains in females using these shoes because of the lack of ability to tolerate this higher stiffness properties from using the shoes?
I wouldn't say that, but maybe Achilles overload has been a little bit more common, I think. Okay. And that's, I think, potentially that it's asking that area to be able to tolerate different loading parameters.
Just because of that very acute change, if you feel like it's more significant in females.
Yeah, whether it's, actually to do with the curve of the ground reaction force becoming sort of different, not being as, typically... It's already in sprinting. It's already an asymmetrical curve anyway. It's not a clear spring sort of behavior. It's front loaded. So whether that's spiking that enormously, I don't know. I haven't seen the data on whether that's been tested. But I wouldn't say necessarily that injuries have been a lot greater. I think over time actually people are adapting to them. So potentially injury rates are maybe even going down, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think with juniors initially we saw it.
We saw it initially, but it seems to have diminished. I think it's just they've adapted to actually wearing them.
Yeah.
All right. I know that you do a little bit of work with team sports in the community. What's your approach to that, given sometimes you don't necessarily always have the resources that you'd like if you were working, say, in a professional club? How do you sort of like to attack that?
It's very different because there's a lot of seasonal work within the community as well. So you go trying to manage training loads and things like that is
very difficult.
So it's been good to just get those that unique exposure to it compared to, I've been in environments where they are sort of semi-elite and you do have a bit more access to a few more toys. The biggest thing it just comes down to, I think, is just talking to them. That's pretty simple.
Inbuilt monitoring, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's interesting, I've played around with a few other technologies in the past, and then you just come back to if you can talk to them and they say they're ready to go.
They're probably ready.
To go. But someone's been sitting on a tractor for 14 hours a day for the last week, and they come to you and they just go, I'm stuffed. And you say, well, you probably shouldn't play, mate. How about you go home, have some sleep? We'll get into it next week.
Do you think that over time... these technologies that are coming out, looking at these monitoring tools, is going to actually help create the ability to explain that, and it's additive. It's not taking away that conversation you have, but do you think it will be able to say, okay, we've combined all of these factors and we can actually see that sitting on the tractor for 14 hours has led to a point where we probably aren't in a position to go and play?
Yeah, I think... at the moment, we're at this period where everyone's watch has a heart rate sensor on it and things like that, and there's a lot of different metrics that, particularly like the Apple Watch and your Garmin, they're spitting at you, and people don't really know how to interpret it, and I think there's a long way to go. Certainly, I don't think the technology is good enough at the moment to monitor things like heart rate variability based on the sensor that's in your watch and everything.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of data around that shows, like, if you're comparing like an Apple Watch, say, to like a 12-lead ECG, that it can be 13 to 15 beats out sometimes.
Okay.
So
that's a lot.
Yeah, which is a lot. And sometimes it'll be quite spot on, but it's all got to do with, you know, the contact with the skin and those sort of things. And particularly if you're moving around playing sport, running, or even when you're sleeping and they're trying to give you some sleep metrics out of it, that's going to change throughout the night. So I think it's really hard to get some of those metrics that will be at the moment and get good data out of them. I think the technology will probably adapt to the point where it is you are able to collect things like heart rate variability quite accurately and get important information out of it to say, like, all right, this guy's he's been pretty stressed the last 2 weeks. We can see that his heart rate variability has decreased. We might need to back the training load off for the week. Where I think some of it is still developing. I don't think we can go and say, all right, it was a bit up today. Let's do another easy session. You can't do a hard session or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think we're at that level yet.
We're not at that level yet.
You have to kind of put it in context, as you said, along with the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't think the conversation's ever going to go away.
No, it shouldn't either.
Let's say more often than not, subjective measures are better than objective measures of monitoring recovery and readiness anyway. So
yeah, I think there's some measures that we can still get good. We can still take a lot out of in terms of how intense the task was and things like that. But yeah, I think. Yeah, it's just going to come back to the conversation is the most important thing, but you can use it with the other data as well to be able to interpret how the level of performance is going to be.
I read an article recently where they've developed this technology within essentially giving someone a tattoo, which that tattoo has certain nanotechnology in it that allows you to monitor things like heart rate, blood pressure really, really accurately.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be a big thing going forward, particularly in like endurance athletes and events, is like real-time glucose monitoring and real-time lactate monitoring. I mean, we have the technology at the moment. It's probably got to re-refine, but the implications that might have on, say, like your fueling and your hydration throughout the race, I think that's going to be a big thing going forward.
Have you seen it? Has there been any research on that, like of elite endurance athletes wearing like the continuous glucose monitors?
No, and I mean, there's been not published data that I've seen. But certainly
that straight away, as soon as you say that, I thought, wait a minute, why isn't that being done? I know like people who wear them just because they are interested.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the individual variability in your blood glucose response to different foods, because it doesn't necessarily relate to, say, glycemic load, which people traditionally think that's the thing.
Yeah, and I think it'd be a good thing to see. Like there was all these photos that came out of Kipchoge when he was training. I think it was the Berlin Marathon last year. And he was wearing a continuous glucose monitoring device. And I think that'd be a cool thing, and it'd probably be one of those things that end up on the broadcast of like a Tour de France or something. You see what,
you can see what's happening.
See what's happening.
A live feed of everyone.
They're getting low on energy. We're going to have to... Yeah.
Actually, that'd be really interesting, because you probably see some things going, how is that person tolerating that heart rate for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, finally, I think it's something we usually ask people like yourself who are curious. What is something that you're exploring and you're learning at the moment that might be related to your work, might not be, but is kind of piquing your interest?
Well, I'm always a big fan of history. I always like reading about particularly World War II. And the things that like really pique my interest are like the improvements in technology and things like that they made particularly throughout that period and other periods. And how that was born out of and how that thinking sort of came about. So,
what did you pick up from it? What is it? A philosophy of like how they approached it, or is it more just actually the technology itself was interesting?
Oh, a bit of both as well. But it's more. I think it's interesting now that we go and we're trying to come up with these solutions, and they say, well, all right, we're going to come up with a solution. We give them all these resources and everything, but the periods where there's big innovation and everything, I think in history, is when you constrain those variables and people have to work with.
It's like time constraints, or there's like limited resources, and they just find a solution.
I bet say
a solution out of it.
And there's also like a dire need to find a solution too.
Yeah.
Because like, you know, I remember reading the a biography of Steve Jobs, and like one of the things that stood out about him is the guy was an absolute maniac in terms of what he expected from people, like, but essentially creating so much pressure and stress that it essentially forced people to go, all right, I need to find a solution to this problem of, like, you know, being able to make this chip really small so I can fit in the phone or whatever it was.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you hear about these things about like how they're going to try and solve like traffic or something like that, and they give them all these resources and like, we're going to get this quantum computer and do all this, and you're like, oh, I don't know what the answer is, but maybe we need to confine the variables more to actually try and come up with a solution.
You got 2 weeks to cut traffic by 50%. Go.
Yeah. So they're the things that pique my interest the most at the moment, I think.
I think that's a really interesting idea, and it's something, you know, we probably should get someone on who works on big complex problems to talk about this, because I think that as we've discussed, even we talked about it last week when we were talking about running biomechanics, and it seems like constraining, you know, complex systems seems to be the quickest way to have it self-organize.
Well, I actually think of that too, without getting too political about this, but think of like current geopolitical tensions happening now, and people are like, oh, because of this, we're going to have famine, or this is going to happen. But generally speaking, people are very poor at predicting outcomes in really dire situations, because I think a lot of people have the ability to create very creative solutions when they really need to. And yeah, it's always interesting when predictability in stressful situations is always not that good.
Alrighty, thank you very much for listening. Jeremy, thank you so much for giving up your time.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, Jack.
Cheers, Jeremy.